Today, to continue from where we left off the other day, we're going to talk about what is known as the Mandate system. Now, this comes out of the League of Nations after World War II. Now, we remember the League of Nations was one of Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. In fact, it was the one he cared about the most. It was the one Wilson was willing to sacrifice others in order to get the League of Nations created. And the irony there is that even though the League of Nations is going to come to be, the United States is never going to sign the Treaty of Versailles, which creates the League of Nations, so we're never actually going to join the League of Nations. Within the League of Nations, the mandate system is established. And let me just read to you the language of the League Charter, which discusses the mandates after World War II. It's essentially a reformed version of colonialism. Not the traditional colonialism where a parent country exploits its colonies for its own benefit, but here we would say a mature nation like Britain or France that undertakes to develop or help the people of empires recently destroyed develop the institutions that will one day allow them to stand side by side as an equal nation state in the League of Nations. Essentially, it's akin to like a parent and children. This is the view that the British and the French are going to have of these people that used to be part of the German Empire, like maybe in Africa, or these people that used to be a part of the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East. That they weren't ready to rule themselves yet. They weren't ready. They didn't have the institutions that a state needs to have in order to exist on a global scene. So Britain and France will be so kind as to take care of them until such a day that they're ready to stand on their own. Now, this sounds quite banal, like Britain and France are giving a lot of, we really don't want this obligation, but we're going to take it over. Remember, the mandates in the Middle East that they ultimately create for themselves out of the League of Nations, because Britain and France are dominating the League, the mandates that they will create for themselves are virtually identical to that Sykes-Picot agreement we talked about from 1916 that was agreed to between Britain and France, not the League of Nations, between Britain and France before the war was even over. So the mandates in the Middle East, there's other mandates in Africa, there's other mandates in Southeast Asia and East Asia that where the Germans had colonies in East Asia. The mandates in the Middle East will ultimately be divided up between Britain and France. There's also originally going to be three mandates in the Middle East. There's going to be an Iraq mandate that the British will control. There's going to be a Palestine mandate that the British will control. And then there's a Syria mandate that the French will control. And as we discussed yesterday, they fit the lines of the Sykes-Picot Agreement. All right? So France is going to get Syria, which also includes today's Lebanon. The British are going to get Palestine, which today is the nation of Israel and then the occupied territories, the Palestinian territories, and the nation of Jordan. And then the British are going to get control of the Mandate of Iraq. As early as 1921, there are problems with this arrangement. You've got uprisings and protests sparking up in Iraq, right? These Iraqis believed they were to get an Arab kingdom, an independent Arab kingdom. This is what was believed to have been promised to the Sharif of Mecca back in 1915 and 1916 through those Hussein McMahon correspondences, right? So you've got uprisings in Iraq. And then you've got uprisings in Egypt. And then you've got the other son of the Sharif of Mecca. We talked about this guy already, although here he is cleaned up and westernized. This is Faisal, the son of the Sharif of Mecca, the guy that helped organize that Arab revolt and eventually claimed as his capital city for Greater Syria, the city of Damascus, Syria. To his right, we have Abdullah. That's the other son of the Sharif of Mecca. So Faisal ibn Hussein and Abdullah ibn Hussein. Well, Abdullah is not happy either. Abdullah thought he would get something out of this new Arab kingdom. His dad is the Sharif of Mecca. So Abdullah puts together an army. He puts together an Arab army and starts marching up towards Damascus, Syria. Marches through Jordan on his way to Syria. Now this is problematic for the British because who's in Syria now? The French. The French were gifted Syria as a mandate. And so Britain does not want to see any kind of war going to the Middle East, does not want beef with the French. So Britain's got to solve this issue, right? And who's going to solve it? None other than this guy. Very important to the story of 20th century global history. This is, of course, Winston Churchill, a younger Winston Churchill. This is Winston Churchill in the 1920s. Actually, it might even be an earlier picture of Churchill. But anyway, in 1921, Winston Churchill is going to organize what's known as the Cairo Conference, where he will lay out his proposals and the British proposals to solve these problems of the Middle East. And here's what he's got. Here's his plan. Faisal, eldest son to Hussein, the Sharif of Mecca, you, upon the independence of Iraq, which will happen in the early 1930s, you are going to get to become King Faisal I of Iraq. You'll be the first independent king of Iraq. High five. Let's get you looking like a Western leader, and you will one day be in charge of Iraq. Abdullah, you aren't going to get to go to Syria, because that's the French mandate, and we can't go telling the French what to do. So you are going to one day be the king of the nation of Jordan. Now, I've already mentioned that this was the original British Mandate of Palestine. So what Churchill proposes and what will ultimately happen is a line will be drawn down the Jordan River all the way to the Gulf of Aqaba. And to the west of that line will be the British Mandate of Palestine. To the east of that line will be the British Mandate of Jordan. Abdullah is going to have the right to rule in Jordan. When Jordan becomes an independent country, Abdullah is going to be the president of Jordan, or the king, pardon me, of Jordan. Now, you don't need to remember this, but just connecting it to today. You might remember the other day we talked about the Sharif of Mecca, that he was a member of the same clan as Muhammad, this Banu Hashim clan in Mecca. Today, the nation of Jordan, and in the 1930s, the nation of Iraq, were officially called the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan and the Hashemite Kingdom of Iraq, to connect the ruling family to that clan, all right? Just like Saudi Arabia is Saudi Arabia. It's ruled by the House of Saud. That's the family that controls it, that rules as monarchs. Now, Iraq, of course, in the 1950s is going to have a coup, and it's going to overthrow the royal family, and they're going to end the monarchy, and eventually they're going to have the dictatorship of Saddam Hussein and such. So Iraq is not a Hashemite kingdom anymore. It's not a kingdom at all. But Jordan is still the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. In fact, some of you probably have seen or heard of the current king of Jordan. His name is Abdullah. You might have heard of him because he's the only Jordanian or only Middle Eastern king who has ever had a bit role on Star Trek: The Next Generation. Yeah. The guy, he's very much westernized. He likes Star Trek. He got himself a little role as an extra on Star Trek: The Next Generation. Very exciting. His wife is named Queen Rania, and she's very prominent in the Middle East and really throughout the world as being an advocate for women's rights and gender equality in Jordan and in other places. So Jordan today is still the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, ruled by King Abdullah. Not this Abdullah, but his grandkid. Abdullah's dad is a guy named Hussein. So the current Abdullah is Abdullah ibn Hussein. And Hussein's dad is this guy, Abdullah. So Hussein, the old king was Hussein ibn Abdullah. And Abdullah's dad was Hussein. So he was Hussein. Oh my gosh, it's confusing. But we're sharing a lot of the names from grandpas, right? So anyway, the royal family of Jordan, and especially that King Hussein, is going to be very important to our story going forward. And that's why I wanted to talk a little bit more about it today, because when we're going to get to the 1960s and into the 70s, King Hussein of Jordan will be important to our story. Good? So now we have a Palestinian mandate. We have a Palestine mandate. So you've got Jordan, and now you've got Palestine. All right? Now, this map, I don't like how it labels it Jewish Palestine, because it's not entirely Jewish. It's not even majority Jewish at all at this point. But it is the place where the Balfour Declaration promised a national homeland for Jews. So the official mandates begin in the early 1920s. And the British mandate in Palestine incorporates the idea of the Balfour Declaration. All right? Now, Winston Churchill, with regard to Palestine, yes, sir?
The Golan Heights was included in the Jewish homeland?
No, this is just a lousy map. Winston Churchill is going to issue in 1921 a white paper. Now, a white paper is a governmental policy paper that describes a government's official position on something. It has nothing to do with race or anything. It's probably just called a white paper because it's literally on white paper. So a white paper is just a statement of government policy. Winston Churchill will issue a white paper from the British government in 1922. And this follows some protests in Palestine. Because as Britain is now supporting the Balfour Declaration in their Palestinian Mandate, more and more Jews are migrating to Palestine. And as more Jews migrate to Palestine, we're going to see frustration from the Arabs in Palestine grow. More Jews coming in, it's raising the price of land, making rents go up for Palestinians, making the price of land purchases go up for Palestinians. As more Jews move in, they would rather the Jews that are living in Palestine would rather hire other Jews for labor rather than local Palestinians. So many Palestinians are finding themselves now out of work, and there's a lot of frustration. In 1921, we see a series of riots break out in the city of Jaffa between Zionists originally, and then spreading into a confrontation with Zionists and Arabs. In the end, you have almost 50 Arabs and almost 50 Jews killed in these riots. This pushes Winston Churchill and the British government to make a statement of policy towards migration of Jews into Palestine. Churchill says, we are still committed to the idea of the Balfour Declaration. So we're not going away from that. So Jewish people in Britain and around the world and in Palestine, don't get angry with us. We're not going away from the Balfour Declaration. But migration to Palestine should be considerate of what Churchill referred to as the economic absorptive capacity of the region. And it's hard for me to think about this now and talk about this now without thinking about the current debates over immigration in the United States. And how some that are in strong opposition to increasing immigration numbers in the American states would say, we love immigrants. We have no problem. But it's costing Americans jobs, right? Well, this was very much the argument of Palestinians in 1921. That, hey, they've got nothing at their core against Jewish migrants coming to Palestine. But it's costing Palestinians their livelihood. And so Winston Churchill and the British government says, all right, we got you. So migration shouldn't continue beyond the economic absorptive capacity of the region. Whatever the economy can absorb, those many people can migrate. But of course, the problem is not going to be solved because Churchill doesn't attach a number to it. There is no migrant quota that is attached to this white paper in 1922. So despite saying we can't go past the economic absorptive capacity, there's no number that's attached to it. So Jews will continue to migrate, and Palestinians will continue to be frustrated. All right? Now, the 1920s are largely quiet after these initial riots. The 1920s are largely quiet. And through the 1920s, the British begin to work in Palestine to support the establishment of a Palestinian governmental body. Like one day it can hopefully rise up and be a state on its own. And the British try to make a blended legislative council where both Jews and Arabs would be represented. But in the British attempts to do this, They're acknowledging the idea of the Balfour Declaration again, that the British support the idea of a national homeland for Jews in Palestine. Now, what does that mean to Arabs when they hear the idea of a national homeland for Jews in Palestine? Yeah, it's one day going to be a Jewish state. And this freaks out the Arabs, who are like, whoa, whoa, whoa. We don't think that there should ever be a Jewish state because it's massive majority Arabs and we've long been here. So that's not fair. And so, because the British continue to support the Balfour Declaration, Arabs are resistant to be a part of any kind of British government. So they drive the Arabs away. So ultimately, the Jews get the most vocal voice in these governmental bodies that the British are setting up. The Arabs are frustrated and they're pushed away. Ultimately, the British are going to turn to this guy to attempt to support and placate the Arab voice in Palestine. His name is Hajj, H-A-J-J, because he went on the Hajj, so he gets that title. Hajj Amin AlHusseini. Hajj Amin AlHusseini. Hajj Amin AlHusseini, of no relation to the Sharif of Mecca or any of that stuff. This guy is a Palestinian. He is the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. He's an important Palestinian leader in Jerusalem. And the British do a lot of their communicating with the Arab people through him. This guy's young. He's only like in his mid-20s in the 1920s when he's made this title. He's actually got no religious training, so he doesn't really have any religious credibility. But the British are using him as their conduit to the Arab people. And they think he's doing a good job because in the 1920s there's not a lot going on. Until we get to 1929. Until we get to 1929. And it centers around this site again. Now we've already talked about this. This is the Western Wall, or the Jewish Wailing Wall. It's the old Western retaining wall of that temple that the Romans destroyed back in 70 CE. And then atop this temple wall, on what the Jews call the Temple Mount, this is the Dome of the Rock for Muslims. That's where Muhammad had his night journey, and it is believed that he ascended into heaven upon a rock within that building construction. The building wasn't there at the time, it was built around it. There's also a mosque on top of this site. Now, the British intention with this area is that it should be free for Jews to pray at the wall, and it's got to be free for Muslims to pray atop the Temple Mount, right? It's got to be free and open. No one can mess with it. The Jewish mandatory rule was this area is like off limits for all parties to do anything to disrupt anybody else from worshiping. But this is what it looks like today. This is what it looks like today. It didn't look like this in the 1920s. In the 1920s, that wall looked like this. Here's the wall that we just looked at from a distance. The plaza that we just saw in that picture is all in front of it. But in the 1920s and before, this is just a narrow alleyway. And you've got buildings and homes and businesses and activity. There is no plaza. Not a lot of room there. Now, we will get to how this happens a little bit in a little bit in this class. Ultimately, this is an after effect of the 1967 war. When Israel won the 1967 Six-Day War, they conquered the old city of Jerusalem, and they essentially tore down a lot of those homes and businesses and shops and created this big open plaza. So we will get to that story. But back in the 20s, it looked like this. Back in the 20s, it looked like this. Now, you can see there's not a lot of room to get around here, right? And so the rule was you can't go messing with this site that would inhibit anybody or prohibit anybody from freely worshiping to the ways that they want to. Well, the Jews were erecting, albeit temporary, they were erecting barriers at the Western Wall. And this is a picture, a modern picture, obviously, from a gate that would be erected today. And here's like a young boy, and he's going through his bar mitzvah, and there is this gate. These are Orthodox Jews, devout religious Jews, and there's a gate. Anyone want to take a stab at why the gate is there? Very good. We got the men over here and the women over here. So it's a separation of men and women at the gate. Now this is a temporary gate. It can be moved in, it can be moved out. In 1929, if one of these gates is put up, can you guys see how it can really have an impedance to traffic getting through there? And that's a problem. And many Arabs were feeling that the Jews were like constructing things at this wall. That was making it harder for the Arabs to get where they needed to go. And in 1929, we have some major riots and protests erupting because of this wall. These are called the Western Wall riots. All right, the Western Wall riots. In the end, after a series of attacks and counterattacks, you've got 133 Jews and 116 Arabs dead. This is bad news for the British mandatory rule. Because the British, what do they care about? Keeping the peace. Because when there's riots, when there's violence, you've got to bring in more British soldiers, right? They just want to keep the peace. And so the British will issue another white paper in the aftermath of these riots, recognizing that Jewish immigration is causing serious Palestinian Arab anger. And you've got to stem the tide of the immigration. Now, of course, when the British say that this immigration is making people angry and we've got to stem the tide of immigration, who is now going to become angry at that? The Jews. So in the next year, the British issue another letter that says, hey, we still support the Balfour Declaration. Ugh. The British are trying to appease two sides that will not ever see eye to eye, right? And then things turn dramatically in the 1930s. In the 1930s, we begin what is known as the fifth Aliyah. I haven't mentioned that word yet, I don't think. Aliyah is a Hebrew word that is used for a movement of Jews to Palestine. 1933 marks the beginning of the fifth and largest migration of Jews to Palestine. What else is happening in 1933? Hitler's rise to power in Germany. So when Hitler comes to power in Germany in 1933, we will see a dramatic escalation in anti-Semitism, not just in Germany, but in other European states as well. Poland, for example, and Austria. It's not a good time to be a Jew in Western Europe or in Central Europe after 1933. So after 1933, thousands, tens of thousands of Jews begin to migrate to Palestine. And if we take a look at these numbers, through the 1920s, 3,500, 3,000, 6,500, 6,400. These are the number of Jews migrating to Palestine. 6,400, 5,500. 1932, 11,000. 1933, 31,000. 1934, 44,000. 1935, 64,000. If the Arabs were getting angry when thousands of Jews were migrating to Palestine, imagine their frustrations as tens of thousands of Jews begin migrating into Palestine because of the anti-Semitism in Europe. All right? Land sales to Jews are increasing, which is creating more landless Arabs. Jobs are at a premium. You can't find jobs. So there's frustration, there's anger, and we begin to see the growing of an Arab nationalist movement. And out of this Arab nationalist movement, yes, sir?
So did the Great Depression play a role in that, in making the Palestinians more angry?
Yeah, you know what? I don't know offhand without doing some more reading about the impact of the Great Depression on Palestine. The Great Depression had its biggest impacts on parts of the world that were like most connected to global economy. And I don't know how much that region was connected. There's probably some impact, but I don't know to say how much of an impact it had. The greatest impact was tens of thousands of people coming rather than thousands because of the anti-Semitism in Europe. In 1936, the Arabs, and I think this, look at this graph, I think this says it best. All right, 1920s, a lot of migration, late 20s, migration really limited. but then in the 1930s, peaked at its highest rates in the Mandate era. In 1936, Arab fighters will rise up in revolt against the British. Remember, the British are controlling the Palestinian Mandate. They rise up in revolt, known as the Arab Revolt of 1936. They rise up in revolt against the British. And this is the last thing that the British want. Because the British want to keep the peace, because keeping the peace, or not having peace, is expensive. So the British want to keep the peace, and now there's no peace. This is the most violence that has happened in this region to date. So the British have a great plan. The Arabs are angry. The Jews would be frustrated if we limited their immigration. So here's our plan. It comes out of a group known as the Peel Commission, who looked into what we could do to solve this problem in Palestine. And what they came up with is what is known as a two-state solution, which is really interesting because today, most people that think there's any solution to be had in the Arab-Israeli conflict see as the solution in two states. Like, this is what Obama and most American presidents have supported, a two-state idea, that there should be an Arab state and a Palestinian state, and they should kind of live side by side as sovereign entities. This is what the British came up with in 1933. This big green hunk would be an Arab state. This bluish hunk would be a Jewish state. And then for areas that are important for all three religions, those would be still controlled by the British. All right? Now, has anybody noticed any problems with this? Like, who do you think would be really happy with this? Wait, why would the Arabs be really happy? Okay, they are getting more territory. Okay, but it was their original land. Whoa, whoa, whoa. And here we have a realization, too, that at this time period, Jews actually owned about 8% of the land of Palestine. Yet the Peel Commission gives the Jews about 28% of the territory. And not only does it give them about 28% of the territory of Palestine, but it's given them some prime 28%. Like half of it's on the Mediterranean Sea. They've got a majority of the Mediterranean coastline, right? And it's in the northern area and the western area of Israel, which is more fertile, whereas half of the Arab land is the desert, the Negev desert in the south. Arabs will be furious at this. No way! Why should we accept anything like this? Why should we accept any Jewish state? Like, maybe an Arab state that Jews can live in, we could probably get along with that. But why any Arab state, or why any Jewish state would take Arab land, I don't get that. So the Arab revolt continues and actually picks up steam as they're now even more frustrated with this proposed solution of the British. We're almost done here, guys. By the end of the revolt, over 20,000 British troops had to be sent in to Palestine to quell this disturbance, this revolt. And by the end, between 3,000 and 6,000 Palestinians were killed. All right? So this was a major revolt between Palestinian Arabs and the British mandatory rule. By spring of 1939, the revolt is under control. What is also happening by spring of 1939? We've got some action in Europe, all right? World War II hasn't quite begun yet, but Adolf Hitler has gone into Czechoslovakia, all right? So it's looking like war is imminent in Europe. In response to this Arab revolt, the British will do what it seems the British can only do best. They will issue another statement of policy, a 1939 white paper, where Britain will now say, nah, we're not going to do this. But what we will do is we will work to, within 10 years, create a unitary state. One state within 10 years. And we will continue to allow Jews to migrate to the British mandatory Palestine. But once the Jews of Palestine get to 1/3 of the population of Palestine, then it's done. No more can come in. We're going to actually, for the first time, put a hard limit on the number of Jews that can move into Palestine. Now, who does this make happy? Really nobody. Because it's still, for the Arabs, it's still allowing tens of thousands of Jews to migrate to Palestine. For the Jews, it's horrible because it means that their migration will be limited and they will never get a state, which they believe now they were told they could one day have. So the Jews are unhappy. The Arabs are largely unhappy. And so the Jews, with World War II imminent, and with the start of World War II, are in a tricky spot. They are angry with the British government because of this white paper, but they have to support the British government against the Germans in World War II. They can't have Germany win World War II, right? So the British policy, or pardon me, the Jewish policy, the Zionist policy in Palestine is going to be stated as such. The Jews are going to fight the white paper as if there's no war. So they're going to do whatever they can do to get people into Palestine beyond the requirements or the restrictions of the white paper. They're going to try to stick it to Britain and get more and more Jews in, even beyond the white paper quotas. They're going to fight the white paper as if there was no war. And they will fight the war as if there is no white paper. Which means they got to beat Germany. So whatever the Jews can do to help the Germans be defeated, giving aid to the British to help the Germans be defeated, they've got to do that. So the British are actually, or the Jews are trying to balance their frustrations with the British white paper of 39 and the absolute need to defeat the Germans in World War II. Now, World War II comes. World War II comes, and we know it is going to be a disaster for European Jewry. 2/3 of the Jewish population of Europe will be killed during World War II, about 1/3 of the global Jewish population. So Jews in 1939 numbered almost 17 million. By the end of World War II, they're in about 11.5 million Jews in the world. All right? About 55,000 of them will make it into Palestine during the war. It is very hard for Jews to migrate to Palestine during the war for obvious reasons. The Nazis are murdering them. It's hard to escape, all right? In fact, if we look back at that chart I was showing you, look at what happens. 1937, 12,000, 38, 15,000, 39, 18,000, 40, 5,600. 41, 4,200, 42, 3,000. So the numbers are dramatically decreased during the Second World War. All right? So one of the greatest areas of frustration for the Palestinians was the great migration of Jews coming into Palestine. Well, guess what's eliminated during World War II? The great number of Jews coming in during Palestine. And this won't work out too well for one Palestinian leader. During the war, the same AlHusseini, who the British were using as a Palestinian leader that they could be the voice of Palestinian Arabs, he had a sit-down with Adolf Hitler in Germany during World War II. Because Adolf Hitler had as big of issues with Jews in Europe as AlHusseini thought he had with Jews in Palestine. They had a common enemy in the Jewish race. And AlHusseini and Adolf Hitler had conversations about this. This is not going to look good for the Arabs. Adolf Hitler had hoped that AlHusseini can go back to Palestine. And if you guys hang with me for a moment, I'm almost done here. He had hoped that AlHusseini can go back to Palestine and start to rally and round up Arab support to start targeting and attacking and rising up against Jews in Palestine. Because if there can be riots and protests in Palestine, what would Britain have to do? Send troops, which would divert troops from the war effort in Europe. But guess what? People only stick their necks out when they feel that they are in immediate crisis or immediate danger. And what have the Palestinians been feeling during World War II? The Jews kind of stopped coming during World War II. So we're not as frustrated or as angry as we used to be. And so no major uprising is going to be found. But after the war, this is a PR disaster for the Arabs. Public relations disaster for the Arabs. Because Adolf Hitler, everybody knows what he is. And now a supposed leader of the Palestinians, even though many Palestinians didn't even like this guy, is now being publicized to have been in cahoots with Adolf Hitler. All right? And this is not going to work out well. Also, we have the Holocaust. And we'll talk in a couple days about how that's going to increase sympathy towards giving the Jews of Europe an escape from Europe. And we will see migration to Palestine begin to grow, or support for Jewish migration in Palestine grow, now not necessarily from the British, but from other world powers. And we'll talk about that more in a couple days.